We're going to kick the day off with a phenomenal keynote speaker. We have, excuse me, a retired Associate Vice Chancellor and Chief of Police, Sue Riseling, who is currently the president of the Riseling Group, LLC, which is a firm that specializes in working with cities, villages, universities, and private companies on a range of public safety needs. From internal investigations to staffing studies, race and diversity training to Title IX, from continuity of operations to crisis management, providing expert reviews and after action reports. Riseling served for 3 years as executive director for the International Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators after she retired from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. At Wisconsin, she served as Associate Vice Chancellor and Chief of Police for 25 years. Prior to her appointment as chief in 1991, she served at the State University of New York, Stony Brook, and at the University of Maryland, College Park. Often the first woman to hold the positions she was named to, she often excelled in professional associations as well. She won the International Association of Chiefs of Police Award for Civil Rights, the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives Motorola Police Executive of the Year, Police Executive Research Forum's Career Leadership Award, and the United Way Dane County Woman of the Year Philanthropy Award.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate the introduction, and we're off and rolling. So let's get to the first slide. So just a little quick story about me, from bicycles to badges is what I like to call this. Back in 1968, oh dear, it was a long time ago. I was 8 years old and I was riding my bike near my home in Washington, D.C. That's where I grew up. And as I was riding my bike, I got a flat tire. And I jumped off the bike and was disgusted with myself that I had a flat tire on the back where the whole chain and gear shift was, and couldn't do much with it. So I had to kind of put the kickstand down and take a look. And while I was doing that, I noticed something shiny in the ground, and I looked over and I thought it was a quarter, which in 1968, I just want to let you know, you could buy 2 candy bars and a soda pop for 25 cents. So that tells you how old I am. Or 5 postage stamps. So anyway, I looked at that, dug it out, and instead of it being a quarter, it was actually a bona fide real police badge that had somehow become embedded in the dirt. So it was really kind of a cool thing. And so I picked it up and I walked my bike home, and I informed my mother that when I grew up, I was going to be a policeman. And she turned and looked at me and she said, "Susan, you can't be a policeman." I said, "Why not, Mom?" She said, "Because you're a little girl and policemen are men. And little girls can't grow up to be policemen." Well, I was pretty sad about this. And also, I just thought that was incredibly unfair. And one of the reasons I thought it was unfair was because my next door neighbor, Kathy Cole, she wanted to be a fire truck when she grew up. And I figured if Kathy could be a fire truck, I certainly could be a policeman. So from there, I went forward, and I'll go to the next slide. I went forward and went into the police academy and graduated from the police academy and went into law enforcement. And at the age of 30, I became the chief of police at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin, the home of Bucky Badger. And when I retired in 2016, the accomplishments that are listed on the screen were things that I was really, really proud of. So we had reached a 25-year low in crime while I was the police chief, and also a 30-year, a 35-year, 40-year. And then when I retired, it was a 42-year low in crime. And then I left in 2016, and you know how it goes, right? As soon as you leave, everything goes to heck in a handbasket. So, only kidding. I think they're doing really well at Wisconsin, and I'll move on from there. So while I was at Wisconsin, if you can move to the next slide, please. I had a lot of great experiences, and some of those were with the National Association of Women Executives in Law Enforcement, and that was actually an association I helped found, the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives, or NAWLE. And there were 6 of us, 6 women chiefs, and we founded that. in 1996, and it's grown strong now. It's got hundreds and hundreds of members, and we mentor women to move up through the chain and get into leadership positions. I got to meet presidents of the United States. I got to work on legislation, got to do all sorts of fun things. And the right side, the pictures that you see there of all those crowds, back when the Occupy movement first began, the Occupy movement took over the Capitol in Wisconsin, in Madison, Wisconsin. And when they took it over, it wasn't anything like January 6th, by the way. This was back in 2011. The state asked me to run the law enforcement response. So every day I would be assigned 500 police officers, and we had to figure out how to police a crowd. And overall, the crowd over those 30 days was 1.5 million people. And I'm proud to say that while I was responsible for the policing, in 1.5 million people, we had 4 arrests, because I try to approach things very differently than the traditional law enforcement. So enough about me. Let's talk about what's going on in this world and why are we here today. So I want to take you back, if we can move to the next slide. If I want to take you back to 1950s. Now the 1950s, just to put it into context, that was the Korean War. That was also the sitcom Happy Days with Fonz, motorcycles, and Elvis Presley, all those things going on in the 1950s. Well, there was a laboratory, Bell Laboratory, that had worked on the telephone. And at that time, there was only one telephone system. It's called Ma Bell. It was a monopoly. It was later broken up by the federal government. But back in the 1950s, if you had a phone from the Bell Telephone Company. And Bell Labs had all sorts of great engineers. And one day, the president of Bell walked in the 1950s, and he said, and it was a he, and of course all the people in the room were men. He said, listen, overnight, locked them all in a room. He said, overnight, the phone system in the United States as we know it has been destroyed. Your job today is to reinvent it. What would it look like? What components would it have? What would it do for us that it doesn't do today? You've got an opportunity to wipe the whole thing out and bring it back. Now, in those days, everything was hardwired, literally, to the wall or to your outlet in a wall. It was hardwired, and you can see all the cords and everything. And people started thinking about it. And one of the men said, well, the first thing I do is I get rid of that silly dial. I got fat fingers, can't put my fingers in the dial. Somebody else said, do you notice how the cord is always too short? I mean, whenever you're on the phone and you just got to reach for something, the cord is always too damn short. Can't quite get there. And one started talking, the other one started talking. If we could move through the slides, one of the things they said was, yeah, let's replace that stupid dial with like a button. Like, why can't you push a button for number 1 or button for number 2? And they went back and forth and talked about that for a while. But one of the interesting things is they didn't convert right away in the telephone industry to push buttons. But one of the guys listening thought about that. He was in finance. And he thought, wouldn't it be interesting, instead of those old adding machines where you had to push down on keys and then crank a handle, wouldn't it be interesting if we could just push a button for the numbers? And out of that, he created Texas Instruments. And Texas Instruments was the first place to have a calculator where you could actually push buttons and numbers would appear on a screen. It was revolutionary. And eventually the phone company went to the push buttons. And as you can see, they started to do it in designer colors too. Isn't that a lovely mustard yellow or whatever terrible color that is? I can't imagine the room that would go well in. That would just be something. If we could move along to the next slide. So then from there, as you all know, because you probably have heard your parents and grandparents talk about the revolution of the cordless phone. Ooh. Now the base still had to be wired into the wall, but you could take that handheld and you could walk around and have a conversation. No more cord holding you to the wall or to your desk. And then the idea in that room back in the 1950s as they were sitting around was this concept of, well, have you ever been talking to somebody and you're looking at something and you wish they could see the same thing you were seeing, but there's no way to do that? Because back in the hardwired days, there wasn't anywhere to show anything. And the concept was, how could I get this document to the person I'm talking to? And out of that came the fax machine, facsimiles. Now, of course, today we email everything, we send everything virtually. It's kind of hard to imagine that we actually sent things electronically that spit out a piece of paper that, by the way, was the worst quality paper in the world. It curled and you just couldn't use it, but we did it anyway. And we thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. So if we can move on to the next slide, then we went to the cellular world, right? Because back in the 50s, when they were sitting around thinking about this, they said, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we could talk to people on the phone, like while we're driving? And people were like, are you nuts? Because everything was hardwired. Everything was that stupid plastic dial. And then it was like, I'd like to see the people that I'm talking to. Somebody else said, well, I don't want to see the people I'm talking to, and I certainly don't want them to see me before my morning coffee. So, okay, so if we had a way to see each other, we should also have a way that we cannot be seen. That's kind of an interesting concept. And it was this idea that we should have the ability to communicate anywhere we want, without cords, without restrictions. We could send things to each other. We could see things. And then this person said, what would it be like if we could have the same meeting we're having today in 1950, if we could have that with each other when we're not in the same room? Like, what would happen if multiple people could be on a call at the same time? Like, we could talk about things. We could conference, and we wouldn't have to be in the same place. And we could all be looking at that same document. And from that one meeting, I give you today's world. I give you Zoom. I give you the iPhone. I give you cordless communication, Bluetooth, all of it. All of it came from one CEO deciding that for a day, he would take some qualified, very costly salary-wise engineers and get them in a room and have them design a new phone system for the future. But the way that happened was by saying that the current system was gone, that it didn't exist anymore. Free yourself from the existing system. Think of it in terms of what you want to see, not what is. And understand that you don't get there overnight. Right? The 1950s is 72 years ago. That's your grandparents' lifetime, right? Or our parents' lifetime, depending on how old you are. Or our lifetime, depending on how old you are. And the idea here that I want to give you permission to do today is, as you're listening to great researchers talk about their research, talk about what's going on in the field of criminal justice, and if we could go to the next slide, I want you to think about what would it be like in the ultimate sense? Because if you really think about a massive transition, so now we would be out to 2092, 70 years from now, 2092. what could criminal justice look like? That's hard to see because you think of all the medical advancements, all the physical advancements, all the environmental changes that might come our way, technology that would change. But how can we reimagine the criminal justice system and get there in 50 years? Say, oh my goodness, we can't afford to wait 50 years. I mean, we've got real problems right now. We do have real problems right now, and we need to address those. But we always need to have our eye on the horizon. And we have to have our eye on the horizon and the vision of where we're going to go, rooted in some deep, deep principles. And I think that one of the greatest principles on which to base a criminal justice system is this quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If we don't see this as a collective, if we don't understand that this doesn't just affect women, men, those who are transitioning, straight, gay, rich, poor, Americans, as well as the rest of the world, if we don't understand that wherever there is injustice, it's wrong, and we need to weed it out and figure out how to turn that around, we're not envisioning a whole new system. And so if we could move to the next slide, please. What's the future going to bring? This was a poem that I had in my office when I was chief, from the day I was sworn in, the ripe old age of 30, to the day I retired at the ripe old age of 56. I want you just to take a second and read that and think about that. Because when I throw terms around like 50 years, that's within my lifetime. I'm older than 50. The children of today are going to grow up, and someday, we hope, fingers crossed, no more pandemics, are going to be 50 years old or 60 years old or 70 years old. And in their lifetime, what is it that they would see? When I was 8 and I found that badge, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated that year. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated that year. The country was embroiled in the Vietnam War. I told you I'm old. And in my lifetime, all the changes that have taken place, from an African-American president of the United States to hopefully very soon, the first African-American woman to serve on the Supreme Court. The first woman to ever serve on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. One of the great thrills of my life was meeting her, having dinner with her. So we've come a long way. We have a long way to go. The criminal justice system has come a long way. If you look at the history of it, it's becoming a better system, even though it's still far, far from good or perfect. It's the best system that we have. And we've got to do more than tweak around the edges. We need to take some holistic changes. We need to go from the dial phone to the iPhone. And in criminal justice, we need to go from where we are today to a whole different world. And how do you get there? Well, the research. What do we know works? What do we know doesn't work? And take some of the emotion out of this, because people are driven a lot by emotion. And get down to some data. But don't get too caught in the data. Data is really just information. What's key here to transform everything is knowledge. Data turned into information is what you're going to get today. People have collected data and studied things, and they're going to give you some information. But it's when you put it in context, when you understand the politics, the dynamics of the society, that's when it becomes knowledge. And it's based on that knowledge and wisdom that you go forth with solid, long-lasting, and meaningful change. So with that, I'll be happy to take your questions, and maybe we can advance to, I believe, the last slide. Thanks for having me.
Again, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A area. Awesome. Our first question is, what is the biggest impediment that you see that prevents us from reimagining?
Well, I think one of the toughest things is that we can't literally overnight destroy the justice system, right? We have lots of laws and lots of structure, and there's a whole industry around criminal justice. So one of the things that stops us from reimagining is the fact that we're so caught in the current system that we can't step back and reimagine. And we don't have the kind of government authority to make the big changes. We have, one federal government. We have 50 states that make laws, and then you've got cities, towns, and villages that make ordinances, and you can get things tripped up pretty easily. One of the things about Ferguson and the Michael Brown shooting was that people thought that Ferguson started when Michael Brown shoplifted and then left that store, and then the police officer saw him jaywalking, terrible offense. And then it ended up in his death. The Ferguson situation started years and years before with the systemic laws and rules that fined people for minor infractions and made it economically infeasible to survive. And the way the town actually made its economic engine work for government was through fines. So the only way they supported the police and fire and the mayor and all those things was through this economic struggle. So one of the things that's really hard for us is we're in a capitalistic system. We've got 50 diverse governments in the states, one federal government, and everybody can take action independently in their own hometown. And so one of the things that's really difficult is there is no one criminal justice system. So we have to back up and take a look at the broad context of the system, but then we'd have to apply it in at least 50 different locations. So I think that's a huge impediment. I think it's a huge challenge. And it would take, I think, a national effort to kind of reimagine, like we've seen with the Sentencing Commission. And we've seen back in the 1960s when President Johnson had a blue ribbon commission on criminal justice. And President Obama had a blue ribbon commission with the 21st century policing. I think that was excellent. Look at policing, but policing is only one component of a very, very large system. And I will just put my plug in for education. I think the greatest equalizer in our system is education. People who can get access to education and get a higher education, it's shown, have less challenges economically and legally than those that lack an education. So our educational system is a huge component of this too.
Thank you. Our next question is, what do you think criminal justice will look like in a decade?
Sadly, I think that criminal justice will look like it does today in a decade because of the fractured nature of our politics. I think that we're going to make some headway in some states with sentencing reform. I think we're going to make some headway in some areas with alternatives to incarceration, because incarceration is just super expensive. I hope within a decade, we have finally learned as a country that incarcerating people who are addicted to drugs has little or no value, and that we figure out the treatment angle in order to help those people get back to meaningful and fulfilled lives, and they're not just caught in a terrible endless cycle, especially with opioids. So I think in 10 years, we will see a system that I hope deals better with drug addiction, reduces incarceration levels because we find alternatives to incarceration, and that we figure out how to decouple prisons from profit. I think if we can decouple prisons from profit, we will have made some serious headway in 10 years.
Thank you. Now, you've already begun to answer this next question, but if there was anything you'd like to add, that next question is, what do we need to improve?
Well, again, my bias will show that I spent a lot of time policing higher education. I definitely think that we need to improve education in the country as a whole. That's number one. But number two, I think we need to look at prosecutors. You know, why do they charge? And what do they charge? And how is that aligned with race? How is that aligned with economics? And I think it's aligned with those two factors more than any other factor. I could be wrong, but I really believe that race is influenced prosecutors, and I also believe the economics of the individual. If you have a wealthy person, regardless of race, but if you have a wealthy person who can afford the best attorneys, I think that they get a very different outcome in the system than those that can't. And my daughter happens to be a public defender. I'm very proud of her. Makes for very interesting Thanksgiving conversations around the table, as you can imagine, me being former law enforcement, her being a public defender. But the fact of the matter is I deeply respect what she does. And it's such a key part of our system. And I think we should make improvements to public defenders. And not just because it's my daughter, but because that part of the system is a weak part of the system sometimes when it comes up against the caseloads that they have are nothing like private attorneys. And I think it's an unequal playing field. And I think that we need to level that playing field by having better defense attorneys. So that's a couple things that I think we could do right now. But I think prosecutors need study. And I think how they decide to charge and what they decide to charge, I don't know that it's always based on the law as opposed it is to the individual economic situation and race of the person that's in front of them.
Thank you. Our next question is the quest for change and reform more difficult now in this climate than it was 70 years ago?
You know, it feels like we're in a really tough situation right now. And that's because we are. We really are, right? Because people have gone into individual action in the extreme. And that's, I mean, like active shooters. That's how we resolve things. And even whatever you make of the moment at the Oscars when Will Smith defended his wife's honor, but also walked on a stage and slapped another person. That that would have never happened 70 years ago. But 70 years ago, when you think about it, it's amazing. African Americans did not really have the right to vote. I mean, they had the right, but everything was put in their way to make sure that they couldn't vote until the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So we've come a long way. And while today seems really difficult, I've got to believe that the 60s, when we're embroiled in a war, when we're assassinating our leaders, when we have denied a huge portion of our population the right to simply cast a vote, when back then women too didn't have the same rights that they have today. No women on the Supreme Court. Only one African American Thurgood Marshall. You know, certainly no African American, Asian American vice president of the United States. Certainly no woman vice president of the United States. We've made a lot of progress in that time, but this is a tough time. And one of the things that's really tough is that when people talk, other people just don't listen. If you can truly listen and not think about what your response is going to be just when the person stops talking, but actually listen to what it is that they say. And what I have found is that when anybody's saying anything, even things I just adamantly disagree with, I try to find something in what they're saying that I can agree with, and I can start my answer with yes, and, or I agree with you that, ... And I also think this or that in counter to what it is that they have been saying. So I think we have a tough time right now because our politics are difficult. But you know what? I think there's extremes on the right. I think there's extremes on the left. I'm still a believer that the middle is so much more populated if we could just turn down our rhetoric a little bit, listen, and have genuine conversations. So I think we have time just for one last question because I don't want to get everyone off schedule. So maybe one last question. Kayla, you got
Yes.
one more for me?
I sure do, and it is a great one. What is your advice? What is your advice for women to advance to leadership positions in criminal justice institutions?
Oh, here's the thing about women. Women think they have to be super prepared, know every answer that might be of every question ever posed to them, or mastered every skill that they're going to need in their new job before they'll take the new job. Now I'm speaking in generalities. Men aren't like that at all. Men are brought up in a system where they right away usually have a teacher, a mentor, or a coach, especially if they join a sports team. And when they join the team, they don't necessarily know how to play the game. And there's a coach there that teaches them how to play the game. And I think that one of the greatest advances for women has been the opening of Title IX and all of the sports elements, because women have learned teamwork. They've learned that there's a coach that will instruct you, that you can make a mistake and you can still win the game. The people do keep score and that you do advance, but there are rules. And if you play within those rules and you play the best of your ability, you get ahead. So in sports, talent and energy and practice all kind of align. And I think it's important for women to be active in sports or clubs or those kinds of things. But women wait too long to try to advance, is my real message. They think, oh, I don't have enough education. Well, I don't have enough experience. Well, I don't have enough this. I don't have enough that. And one of the reasons is because that's what we've been told over and over and over again. But you know, you only can accomplish what you attempt. If you never attempt it, you won't accomplish it. So I believe that women should wait a shorter period of time. Sure, get your education, get experience, get some, bona fides, get your resume together, but try. What's the worst that can happen? You don't get the job or you don't get the promotion. Oh, well, try again next time. And if you don't get a job or a promotion, wait 6 months. And then go to whoever it was that promoted or hired the person and respectfully say, I think you made a great decision. I think that person is wonderful and working out well. I'm just curious if you can give me any suggestions on what I could do to put myself in a better position for the next round. So you're not in there questioning what they did. You're not in there saying you were wrong. You're just in there trying to gain information and knowledge. And then whatever they say, don't argue. Just listen, thank them for their time, and you can walk out and say, that gal's crazy. Or you can embrace what they suggest, make yourself a stronger candidate for the next time around. But go for it. What are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? Go for it. The worst thing you can do is you gotta lick your wounds a little bit. But that's okay. You learn as much from your wins as you do. I think you learn more sometimes from your losses than your wins. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I hope you have an incredibly productive day. And when in doubt, always move forward.